I'm pretty sure by this point that all of the Duel Links players and the TCG players understand that both formats are extremely different. Oftentimes, cards and archetypes that were really bad in the TCG see a ton of play in Duel Links, and pretty much in every single case of a Duel Links Tier 1 deck, it hasn't seen play in the TCG, which is just absolutely crazy. But also, Duel Links has a ton of differences in terms of the mechanics of how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is played, so that even though Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards are still being used in both the TCG and Duel Links, Duel Links has a ton of restrictions. There's no main phase 2, there's only 3 monster and spell and trap card zones. There's a whole bunch of changes when you move to Duel Links from the TCG that make it really challenging for a new player. And in the past, I've talked about cards that can't be added to Duel Links that are outdated in the TCG simply because they're too powerful for Duel Links. But in today's video, I want to take a look at another angle and not so much focus on the power of cards, but I'm going to talk about in today's video 5 cards that they can't add to Duel Links because they simply mechanically do not work. I would like to mention before we start the actual list that I am aware that Konami actually has changed a few cards, just a very small amount of them, to fit in the Duel Links format when they can't really get around adding the card to the game. One of them that's very popular in terms of a card that they drastically changed, or at least changed like half of its effect, is Crystal Beast Emerald Tortoise. And the reason they changed this card's effect is because its battle position changing effect didn't really work in any phase other than main phase 2, because to activate it you had to have already attacked. In the case of adding Crystal Beast to Duel Links, which Konami obviously really wanted to do because they fit the GX era so perfectly, they had to add Emerald Tortoise, so they removed that line completely, which basically makes Emerald Tortoise a normal monster for all intents and purposes. So I do want to acknowledge that Konami has done this. However, in the case of many of these, I don't think it's feasible because they would change the cards too much to the point of them being unrecognizable. In the case of Emerald Tortoise, they had to add it because they wanted to add all of the Crystal Beast monsters, and it'd be pretty weird and sort of unusable if they only added 6 out of the 7 of them. Anyway, the first card that can't be added to Duel Links is Leo, the Keeper of the Sacred Tree. Now, it is a really cool card, and it probably would fit into Duel Links format if it wasn't for the fact that Duel Links didn't have a main phase 2, because at the moment Duel Links is lacking strong synchro monsters, and I think Leo isn't too strong if it actually worked mechanically, but it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because Leo's effect is your opponent cannot target this card with card effects except during your main phase 2. So if Konami was to add this to Duel Links, they would have to do one of two things. First off, they could just change the text to say your opponent cannot target this card with card effects, because that would be basically what its effect would be if you took out main phase 2, or they bring it in as a normal monster, and both of those options do not seem very good. In the case of removing the main phase 2 part of the effect, I think the card might be too powerful. Obviously, there is non-targeting removal in Duel Links. Stuff like Widespread Ruin is commonly played, especially at the lower ranks, but in terms of the higher ranks, many people just rely on cards like Enemy Controller or Treacherous Trap Hole, which Leo would be completely immune to. So they could add this card as a completely just no effect monster, but would that really keep the flavor of what makes Leo so good? I think it wouldn't, and I think it would be very unlikely for Konami to change an effect monster to a normal monster just to add a level 10 synchro monster to Duel Links when there are other level 10 synchro monsters available that probably wouldn't be too powerful. Next up, we have Scapegoat, and the reason that Scapegoat can't be added is pretty obvious. There aren't actually enough zones to summon 4 goat tokens, and I know what you're saying, why don't they just make it summon 3 goat tokens? And the reason that they really can't do that is because that would make the picture a little strange. The picture shows 4 scapegoats. Why are you only summoning 3? It wouldn't make sense for a lot of players. One of the colors would be left out, and that'd be pretty disappointing. What if your favorite scapegoat was the blue scapegoat and you found out you never could summon it? That'd be pretty sad. So they can't add scapegoat to the game, which is kind of a good thing, because if we're being completely honest, the only decks that would play scapegoat are some of those dumb stall decks, because in Duel Links, because you can only have 3 zones, if you could instantly fill up all 3 zones with just one quick play card, especially if you're allowed to have 3 copies in your deck, that's basically 3 turns of your opponent not being able to attack you, which is pretty frustrating. And stall decks are sort of already all over Duel Links, so I think adding another tool for those decks is not a good idea. Now, if we're taking stall decks out of the equation, Scapegoat would be kind of cool for slower strategies to actually build a defense, but I think at this point, because they're not going to add Scapegoat, you're kind of stuck with using cards like Wall of Disruption. Moving back to Synchro monsters, let's talk about one that Konami could not add to Duel Links without making a skill surrounding it, and that is shooting Quasar Dragon. Now, already in the TCG, when Quasar Dragon first came out, it was pretty tough to summon it. Now, I know that there were several 2, 3, and 4 card combos to bring it out, but many of those decks were one-trick pony decks that weren't very successful in the competitive Yu-Gi-Oh scene. But adding this card to Duel Links would be almost impossible for a few reasons. Obviously, there aren't any tuner Synchro monsters in the game right now, but that's totally fine. I think later on we might get Formula Synchron, and I'm not even sure if it would be that good in Duel Links. The problem is that with only 3 monster zones, it is incredibly difficult to summon a shooting Quasar Dragon. You would basically have to have a setup where you summon a level 5 Synchro monster next to a Formula Synchron, and then use a level 3 monster with the Formula Synchron to summon another level 5 Synchro monster, and then somehow revive the Formula Synchron, all to make shooting Quasar Dragon. Now, I don't think it's that far-fetched for Konami to add this card to this game if they add it as a skill, although I would sort of err on the side of caution, because shooting Quasar Dragon in Duel Links would pretty much be game every single time. That card is way too powerful to ever be added to Duel Links, so you have sort of this twofold issue where the card by itself is too difficult to summon, but if they dumbed it down to be able to be used in Duel Links, it would just be way too overpowered. Therefore, Konami will likely never add shooting Quasar Dragon to Duel Links. The next entry on this list sort of encompasses a ton of cards, but let's first talk about Blasting Fuse. So in general, Duel Links cannot have any of these column cards in them, and the reason is pretty straightforward. In Duel Links, at least as far as I know, you don't actually have an option to pick where the cards are set on the field, which zone they're set in, which means that if you set Blasting Fuse as your first back row, it would go off 100% of the time as long as your opponent summoned a monster and set a face down, which is pretty often in Duel Links. Most decks at least play some form of back row, so Blasting Fuse would always be a 2 for 2 pretty much every single time you drew it, which is obviously way too consistent for that card. I mean, the whole drawback of a card like Blasting Fuse is that it is hard to put cards in the same column and make sure your opponent does as well, but in a game like Duel Links, where at least to my knowledge you can't pick where you're putting them, it definitely will be way too overpowered. In a similar vein, cards like the Mech Knights could not be added either, because once again, they'd be way too powerful. Now, I know you might be saying, well, Konami could just make it so you were forced to choose where you set cards, and while that is true, I will just say, in terms of like Dueling Book and Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro for that matter, this drastically slows the game down and is likely not worth it. If you think of why were Dueling Network matches so much faster than Dueling Book matches, well, even though obviously there's newer cards in Dueling Book, in Dueling Network, most people didn't select where their cards were going on the field, and that might not seem like a big deal, but especially for a mobile game with a timer, you definitely want to make sure that you don't have to waste time clicking where cards go depending on the column. Therefore, Konami will likely never add any column-based cards into Duel Links, or at least none of the powerful ones. The last card that I want to talk about seems to keep appearing in videos. I don't know what it is about this card, but anyway, Victory Dragon cannot be added to Duel Links, not for the same reason it can't be in the TCG, which in the TCG it's because there's too many issues revolving around when you can surrender and all the things that if you summon Victory Dragon, your opponent can just end the game right there, because you're allowed to admit defeat at any point in any Yu-Gi-Oh game, and while that is true for Duel Links as well, you can just click surrender. In the case of Victory Dragon in the game specifically, it's because in Duel Links there aren't really matches, and I know technically you can play matches in Duel Links, there are side decks available, but for most players, they'll never get to play a match. It's only really outside tournament support, not sort of internal support from people. If you think of the ranked ladder, if you think of the KC Cup, you're not playing matches, you're playing single duels, which I've complained about a lot, but just in general, that's why they can't add Victory Dragon, because in the case of Victory Dragon, if they took that text off of it, once again, just like Leo the Keeper of Sacred Tree, it just becomes a normal monster. But in the case of Victory Dragon, it's a normal monster with seemingly bad stats that for some reason can't be special summoned, and it'd probably be pretty confusing to many Duel Links players. So Konami can't add a card like that because it mentions a mechanic that most players will not experience in the case of matches. Anyway though, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's discussion video. I know it's a little different from what I've done in the past, but I thought it's kind of interesting. There are obviously many differences between Duel Links and the TCG, and therefore I thought it'd be sort of a fun, different discussion to talk about cards that can't be added to Duel Links because of their mechanics in the TCG do not transfer over. Thank you guys so much for watching though. Let me know if I missed any cards or any comments that you have about the video in the comment section below. I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.